This is kind of continuing to touch on reaching out into sort of the hazier areas of IPM, since we've kind of covered the topic ad nauseum. So these are some areas that pest control are heading in, and just some variants on the topic. So as far as announcements are concerned, a reminder that the lab report for monitoring is due next week. So Tuesday's lab will be the Tuesday lab report. Thursday will be the Thursday lab report, so that's the 2nd and the 4th. There is a write-up online, so go there, check it out. This is, again, a group report. For the citrus group specifically, I know that you are missing a lot of data because of the nets. So I wrote up a special citrus group document that's got what I want you to do on it. So just check that out. Right, going to Bayer Crop Science again. One thing, I have vans for today, I have vans for next Tuesday, but there are no vans available next Thursday. So Thursday group are going to have to find their own ride to the lab. Okay? Oh, yes.
So for our almonds, we did almonds, and they pulled out one of our trees with our pheromone trap. And we don't, so what would you like us to do to mimic that?
Just put it in your, when did they yank it up?
Like 4 or 5 weeks ago.
Did you
replace it?
Did you replace your trap?
Yeah. Yeah, we did.
Okay.
I mean, so I think our data would be.
So you're only missing one data point.
Yeah.
Yeah, then just say we're missing one data point because a tree was yanked up.
Okay.
That's perfectly fine. So you will find when you're out in the field, there are lots of things that can happen to screw up your data, and they're not your fault necessarily. It's just part of working out in the field where there's lots of variables going on. So just write it up in your method section. Trees recovered, trees got yanked up, our traps fell down, whatever. Those sorts of things happen. Anything else? All right. So sort of a more philosophical bent for one slide, or actually 2 slides, is this idea that over the course of human history, we've been kind of moving towards this general trend of moving from individualism towards collectivism. The idea that we can all work together in order to basically raise above the abilities of a single individual person. And so, I mean, if you think about this in a lot of areas, it seems pretty clear that in the past, more or less all essential goods were collected at the individual level. If you were like a hunter-gatherer or a farmer, you had to go out and essentially provide for your family or for yourself all the essential things: food, fire, water, etc. And generally, this was all at a really significant individual cost, because it takes a long time to do these sorts of things, especially if you're responsible for gathering all sorts of supplies you need. Consequently, a desire to basically be more efficient in the way that we gather resources and that we perform basic needs drove a lot of people towards collectivism. The idea that we can work together and provide these services in a way that is a lot less expensive in terms of time and money and effort, and ideally provide higher quality products. So you could see this as kind of the general trend towards centralized governments, private companies, free markets, depending on what your particular political persuasion is. But it is this general idea that no matter what, people have slowly over time aggregated into groups, and that this has generally benefited humans in more efficient, inexpensive products. A good example of this would be something like the mail service. I mean, if you think about it, if you're like a peasant in like 1300s England, you know, if you have some message that you need to be sent, first off, why are you literate? Second off, it's going to be a little bit challenging to get it where you need to go. Because on one hand, you could take it yourself, which really digs into your busy peasant schedule, you know, which you could be using to recover from plague, hoeing a field, making porridge, whatever peasants do, right? Yeah, it's all sorts of things you could be doing. Alternatively, you could find someone going where you need it to go, and you give the message to them, which is great and all, but maybe they're not leaving for 3 or 4 weeks, Maybe they go and they throw your letter away and keep your whatever you paid them in. I don't know, plague, like, et cetera, et cetera. But compared to that, a major part of the founding of the United States was the establishment of the Postal Service and the idea that the government, as a representative of all the people, would establish an organization that had a specific role, which was to transport goods over long distances. And essentially, because they distributed those high individual costs across lots of people, those costs went down substantially. And so the Post also has the benefit that it innovates. So, we have now things that essentially we never would have had without the Post. We have things like airmail. We have various companies like FedEx or UPS that can actually compete with the mail service and perhaps provide better service. And so this collectivism generally drives innovation and also makes things less expensive and more efficient. Now, where this relates to pest control is the idea that, on one hand, pest control is collective. We do have these companies that provide pest control products and the like, but at the actual application step, pest control is largely individualized. Generally, you have some PCA or a farmer who is monitoring their field and is applying all the pest control steps at the individual level. And while this is very easy, it's maybe not the most efficient way to address pest problems. Right, so as an advantage, it's simple, can be performed by a single individual. But then on the flip side, the real disadvantage here is that when you're treating an individual field, you're only treating a very small fraction of the total pest population that there is. You're basically getting rid of whatever's feeding on your crop, but if that pest is living in the weeds around your field or is over in the neighbor's field, you're not taking care of them. And this efficiency is really evident in the fact that about 1/3 of all crops grown are lost to pests, whether that's in the field or in storage afterwards. That pests are a really big problem still at all stages. And so what this really gets down to is defining the populations of the organisms that we want to treat. So, are we treating a very local population, or do we want to think of the total population of the pest over a large scale? So just to refresh, populations are basically all of the organisms of the same species living in the same area that could possibly interbreed with one another. So a population is defined by, 1, all the organisms being the same species, and 2, the fact that they can interbreed with one another. So depending on the species, populations can occur over very different scales. So if you think of it, if you're a grower, say growing citrus in Southern California, you are responsible essentially for a single block of citrus. And within that block, you may have some pests that are indeed, their entire population is more or less within that block. From a, treatment perspective, you've got things like water molds, right? You've got certain soil diet-based pathogens that don't travel real far. And so by just treating your field, you could very easily control more or less all the pests that are ever going to mess with that crop from that particular type of pest. But then there are going to be pests like weeds and the like that can move in from your neighbor's fields very easily. On a grander scale, we have to keep in mind that your field is just one field in the context of a very large group of agricultural systems all around you. So this is just a shot of Portersville. So not only do you have to deal with all the organisms living in all of the other people who are growing citrus around you, but also all of them that are living in Portersville on backyard trees and things such as that, things that might not be controlled by your neighbors. And then finally, you have to keep in mind that you are one field in the larger context of the San Joaquin Valley in California, and that there are certain pests that are highly mobile and can move more or less up and down the citrus belt within the matter of a season. And so, while you may have a lot of control within here, in the grand scheme of things, what you do in your little field at these two levels is of somewhat little consequence. So, the idea of area-wide control is that essentially at the individual level, for those populations that we can just manage within our own field, we're doing okay. but that there are lots of pests that we could be treating in a much more efficient manner if we were to work at a larger scale, collectively between growers. So area-wide pest control really posits the idea that we should treat pests uniformly, basically across the total population of the pest over a period of multiple generations. So instead of treating your field, we should be treating all the fields in an area simultaneously, as well as refuges, backyard trees, alternative hosts. And essentially, we should distribute that cost across all growers. So it's almost kind of like, yeah, pest control communism in a way. But what are we watching? Anyway, don't answer. I don't mind. So, yeah, to put a label on it, that does sound like communism, but it's not quite. Let's not put that label on it. That's it's going to be a real killer. It's not quite that same idea. Is that collectivism? Yeah, it's more of a collectivism, which is kind of like communism. Either way, the idea here is that what you want to do is put a high level of control on a very large percentage of the total population for every single generation. So treat the whole population at a relatively high level of control for a long period of time, as opposed to what we do now, which is very high control for a very small percentage of the population in a single location. And this is a technique that, as I mentioned before, really is great at targeting highly mobile pests. So things that can quickly move back into a field after you do sort of a spray. So generally it's applied right now against insects. And as I mentioned, the idea here is that you don't just treat the field, but you treat every single potential refuge that the pest could live within. And as such, we essentially are removing sources that the pest can migrate back into your field from, including things like neighboring fields, abandoned crops, wild hosts, backyard trees, all sorts of stuff like this. So, just to give a sort of example of how this sort of thing works, I've got two quick sort of visualizations of this. Can I have someone hit the lights in the back? This is a little hard to see. Thank you. So essentially what we've got here, yeah, that turns out a little better. So what we've got here are, we've got 10 agricultural fields, and let's say they're growing citrus, because peel miner is a really nice example for this sort of system, right? So what we've got are these white fields that represent the actual citrus that's being grown commercially. In addition to that, we have this dark field here, which is a commercial citrus field that for whatever reason has been abandoned. No one's bothering to do control in there. We've got a wild host here in these berms. So these would be wild plants that can sustain the peel miner. We've got backyard hosts, so random trees that aren't being controlled for because they're just vanity trees in someone's yard. And then finally, we've got an alternative host. This is the one that's the hardest to see, but this color is different from this one. So this would be something like cotton. Peel miners really like cotton, but they don't cause economic damage in cotton because they just sort of dig around in the bowl but don't hurt the cotton itself. So cotton growers never spray for this guy. So the idea is, under traditional pest control, we have a bunch of PCAs go out, they monitor the fields, they say, boy, there's a lot of peel miners, let's apply some control. So they apply the control in all the commercial blocks, but nowhere else. And so while you reduce the populations in those individual fields, you still have a lot of pests hanging out in these abandoned crops, alternative crops, backyard trees, and wild hosts. And that makes it very easy for the pests to repopulate those commercial fields very quickly after you do the treatment. Using an area-wide control program, we essentially have the exact same setup, but for whatever reason, when the person drew these illustrations, they decided to switch this guy, so he goes from vertical to horizontal, which is just annoying to me as an instructor, but doesn't really have any impact on the model, right? So we have the same situation, but under an area-wide control, the perhaps 10 different growers who manage these fields would collectively go in together and would not only pay to spray their individual fields, but would also distribute the cost of applying chemicals to these abandoned sites and these alternative crops. Thus, reducing the pest population largely across all the sites. It looks like their program did not account for backyard trees because those pests are all there. And then not having any large reservoirs anywhere to repopulate those sites from. So while you may have spent more money up front spraying those extra fields, you're probably saving on a second spray down the road because you don't have another infestation coming along the way. And the idea is if this is sustained over and over and over again across seasons, that these pests are never really going to build up to those large populations again that cause economic damage. So, any questions about this before I move on?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the rest of these slides are incomplete. It shows the before control and doesn't show the rest of it.
Oh, that happened in the PDF because the way I do this is I just have white blocks that I put on and I make them disappear as I go across. But in the PDF version, the blocks just look like part of the slides. They don't disappear. So if you check out the PDF version or the PowerPoint version, you can get rid of them. All right. So area-wide control was really pioneered by this guy, Edward Kipling, who was a entomologist at Texas A&M. And he was mostly widely known for, he's the guy who really founded the screwworm eradication project using those sterile insect releases we talked about. But because that in and of itself is an area-wide control program, right? You are basically distributing the cost of pest eradication across multiple growers, and it's applied on a statewide scale, not just a farm level. And so he did a lot of research into how area-wide control could be used effectively. And so back in the day, and this is back before computers, he ran a really simple model on his calculator, in which basically he looked at two different ways that we can treat pests. He looked at what he considered a conventional model, which would be, basically he assumes that 90% of the pest population is going to occur within the crop itself, and that 10% of them are going to be located in some refuge somewhere else. And so under a conventional model, he says basically you provide 99% control of 90% of the pest population. In other words, we almost completely eliminate the pests in the crop, but we don't do any treatments on the refuges. So we're essentially leaving 10% of the population behind in the refuge. As an alternative, he considered an area-wide control, where essentially, using the same amount of control resources, he says, well, instead of putting 99% of that control within just the crop, let's take 9% of that control and let's put it out in the refuges too. So ideally, the same amount of chemical, biocontrol, sterile insects, whatever it is you're using to control, but you distribute it across refuges and crops. So essentially, 90% control across the board. And so he carried out this model for 4 generations, because that's about as far as you want to go with the math, with a calculator. And he found that after 4 generations, he estimated that under conventional control, we're looking at about 12.5 million pests, most of them within those refuges, which makes sense. But under the area-wide control, we're looking at about 125,000 pests, evenly distributed across the landscape. So essentially a 100-fold reduction just by evening out how we apply controls. So from this, you can see that in specific situations, area-wide control has some real significant benefits, that we could lower pest populations across the board and generally make life for all growers a lot easier. But there are also these significant challenges that make it harder to implement as compared to field-by-field control. And for the most part, what this is infrastructure, basically developing the infrastructure to carry out this sort of program, because you do need a fair amount of infrastructure. You need someone in charge. You need someone who's going to coordinate the way that control is performed and paid for. But also you need to have a high level of cooperation. You need to make sure that everybody who is in the program is on board and is following the prescribed path. And what we see is that when there are situations where area-wide control does break down, it tends to be not because the program wasn't, the actual control theory was bad, so much as there weren't enough people getting on board for it to actually really establish itself and provide high levels of control. And in general, in order to get high levels of control and high levels of participation, or basically to make area-wide control work, what you need is to have really broad public participation. You need to have some way to address what we call free riders. And then you also need to have really clear benefits to the growers, because no one wants to get on board when you don't have any sorts of benefits. So we'll just touch on these individually, touch on some programs that ran into stumbling blocks with some of this stuff. So public participation, in my mind, is probably the hardest thing to establish. Essentially, what you want to do, especially in programs like citrus, right? It's not so hard to get a bunch of farmers on board, because you can go up to a farmer and say, you know, if you pay me, you know, $50 per acre for this area-wide control program, I can promise you at least $100 per acre worth of control back. And that's like a no-brainer. You know, they're going to say, that's going to save me money, and if there's evidence that it'll work, then they'll sign on. Where it gets tricky is when you're dealing with pests that can live in people's backyards. So when you're dealing with things like Asian citrus psyllid. Because a lot of people don't want you messing around in their yard, they don't want you on their property, and they oftentimes are just suspicious of these sorts of programs. So getting everybody on board can be very challenging. And oftentimes what this comes down to is either there's a real lack of awareness, and in cases of lack of awareness, you have lots of programs that will basically generate these sort of public awareness blitzes. These are screwworms, emerald ash borer, Asian citrus psyllid. I'm sure you've noticed if you've driven up Highway 99, there's all those Asian citrus psyllid billboards all over the place, just trying to get people aware that the problem exists. But there are oftentimes cases where people are actively trying to sow misinformation into the system and sort of ruin these sorts of things before they get off the ground. And so sometimes you're competing against those sorts of things as well. So public participation also has a bit of a dark side, which is that if you do the initial sort of awareness campaign incorrectly, or if you don't inform a lot of people, public participation can turn into public outrage, and that can really skewer a pest control program right away. And the main challenge here is that if the program becomes political, you're basically dead in the water, because you're automatically going to turn about 50% of the population against it. So there's actually two really good examples of area-wide control programs that didn't work because of this. The sort of California Medfly Attacks and the case of Florida citrus canker. So who's heard of the Medfly Attacks? Got a handful? It's a really interesting case study of kind of early eco-terrorism in the United States. But so it's all based in the Mediterranean fruit fly. This is a fly that basically feeds on a wide variety, over 250 fruit crops, and it can survive in more or less any warm climate. And so naturally, we don't want these things in California because they could devastate a really wide range of crops. So in California, there's been a program going since like the late 60s to basically monitor for these fruit flies, and then anytime they have any evidence that there's some around, they would apply some sort of chemical control to the area. So generally what it is they've got these little pheromone traps, actually they're not pheromone traps, they're pheromone traps, set up all around the port of LA. And so the whole LA basin has all these traps. People go out and check them a couple times a week, and anytime they have medflies, they will spray the area just to knock them down. In the 1980s, they had a series of outbreaks that were really severe. Severe to the extent that what the government did was they didn't just go in and do their sort of traditional spray the trees in the area. They actually flew helicopters over a lot of residential neighborhoods and sprayed malathion, which got a lot of people really upset.
It's because it ruined their paint jobs on their cars.
Yeah, that's exactly.
It's true.
Yeah.
My sister's car had that.
Like just fade them.
Oh, really?
It makes it go from a gloss to a matte.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not evenly distributed over the car, so you get like a nice flat top and glossy sides, and it's not attractive. But yeah, exactly. It damaged their cars and just generally made a lot of people really upset. So in 1989, though, they had these really large trap counts, and the government ended up spending like $60 million to try and control these medflies. And once they got to the end of it, the scientists started looking at the data, and they're saying these are really weird trap counts, because you'd have these really high concentrations in one trap, but all the neighbors would be virtually empty. And they were really widely distributed across the LA basin. So it looked like it had been introduced multiple times in these really high densities, which isn't the way that the fruit fly gets introduced. You kind of expect you'll have an infested piece of fruit, it'll release a couple flies, so you expect sort of like real low density catches. Well, as it works out, later that year, this eco-terrorism group calling themselves the Breeders, they wrote a letter to the editor and published it in a handful of newspapers. The LA Times, I think the Fresno Bee carried a copy of it, a handful of others, where they basically said that they had been rearing these medflies in captivity, and what they were doing was they were releasing them in California as a protest against these chemical sprays that the government was doing. And they said if the government didn't move to something other than chemical sprays, that they would basically release thousands of these flies in the San Joaquin Valley and just sort of, ruin all of their plans in the first place. Now, there's no evidence to suggest that this actually was happening, other than the weird trap counts. And a lot of people will say there was no such thing as the Breeders. It was just somebody who was taking advantage of the situation. But at the same time, we do have those weird trap counts. And they did write a letter. Why would somebody do that? So it's possible it was true. Regardless, though, California was already moving towards using sterile insects, so they accelerated the program. So now when they find medflies, instead of spraying chemicals everywhere, they just release a boatload of sterile medfly males into the area to outcompete in the mating stage.
So economically, was that a better deal than paying helicopter pilots to spray all those expensive chemicals around these cities?
These sterile insects?
Yeah.
I am not entirely sure. I think it certainly is a better deal economically if you're going to encourage people to release flies and cause you all sorts of headaches. But, sorry? Exactly. I think it might be more dollar-wise than the chemicals are, because chemicals are nice that you can pop them in a, garage somewhere and let them sit.
The crews involved in operating helicopters and the costs associated with the pesticide.
Yeah, I would be
and
curious.
The lawsuits involved in all the destroyed paint jobs.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say probably once you factor in all the lawsuits and the paint jobs, it's definitely cheaper to move to the sterile insects. As far as I can tell, sterile insects haven't irritated anybody to the extent of, well, plus if they want to rear sterile insects and release them, that's fine. So, and then there was this case of the citrus canker. This is a fungal disease that was introduced to Florida in the late 90s. And there was a big program basically to try and eradicate the pest from the area. It was established, I want to say, sort of the Miami-Dade area, I believe. And so it wasn't widely spread throughout the state. And the growers were doing a really good job of controlling it in the field, but they kept getting these reintroductions from backyard citrus trees. And so what the government wanted to do was create an area-wide control program where they would essentially go into these backyards, identify infected trees, and then tear them out, with the idea that once you get rid of those inoculum, it'll just naturally peter out because the growers will keep controlling. The problem was that the inspectors were given really wide latitude with how they could inspect, so they were kind of just walking into people's yards. They didn't need a warrant to inspect the trees, and they didn't need permission to tear the trees out. And so a lot of people were upset because their seemingly healthy trees were getting torn out. And they ended up with all sorts of protests, like the Stop the Citrus Gestapo. So as soon as you elevate the conversation to sort of Nazi propaganda, it's a toxic situation. So it was apparently pretty bad. So what ended up happening was a bunch of the homeowners took the state government to court and held up the program for 3 years. The problem was within those 3 years, they had 3 major hurricanes go through the state and pick up all these trees and shred them and disperse them very widely. And so citrus canker very quickly spread across the orange-growing regions of Florida and is now just sort of a fact of life there. So essentially, they didn't strike while the iron was hot, and so the program became completely irrelevant. So as far as addressing free riders are concerned, so the real benefit of area-wide control is that everybody works to pay a small amount in order to suppress a large pest population over a wide area. And as such, it's essentially a public good. You pay a little bit, you get a big benefit. But on the flip side, you don't necessarily need to pay to get that benefit. There are people who are free riders, those who choose to benefit from the public good without contributing to the costs of the benefit. So these might be people who are just skeptics. You know, they don't think that the program's going to work. They don't want chemicals in their yards. Maybe you could think about it like anti-vaxxers. You know, you think that vaccines are going to harm your child in some way, and so you don't inoculate them, but you still get the benefit of vaccinations because everybody else is vaccinated, and the chances of your child bumping into another child who's unvaccinated are very low. Perhaps they are generally negligent or antagonistic towards the program, so they have a sort of a vested interest in seeing it not work. That's unusual, but there are people like that.
Can't tell me what to do.
Exactly, can't tell you what to do. And generally, these people are dangerous because they provide refuge to the pests, but also, if you get enough freeloaders in the system, free riders, excuse me, it's freeloaders, free riders, I mean, same thing. If you get enough people free riding on the system, it's going to dissuade other growers from participating. Because they're going to say, well, if my neighbor doesn't do it, and they get all the benefits, you know, they're going to be that much less likely to do it themselves. I'll hold on a second. There was actually kind of an interesting thing in the Midwest when BT corn became really popular. One of the groups that benefited the very most from BT was actually organic corn growers, because BT was so widely grown, major insect pest populations went down, and all of a sudden you had all these organic growers who were looking at a whole lot less pests flying into their system. So those are kind of free riders, but because of refuge situations, it's actually for the best. You want to have organic corn refuges for the pests to grow up in anyway, just to sort of slow down evolution of resistance. All right, and so really, the only really good way to avoid free riders is just to make sure that in the program you have crystal clear benefits that people are going to get through that particular control. And I mean, that makes sense on any number of levels. In some cases, the benefits of the pest control itself are good enough that everybody wants to participate. We've got situations in the San Joaquin Valley like the pink bollworm program, where essentially the cotton growers all chip in, and they have a system of pheromone traps that monitor for pink bollworm, and anytime one is found, they release sterile males to knock down the population. And because of that, I don't think there's been like an actual chemical spray for pink bollworm in California cotton for like decades. And on the flip side of that, there are things like government subsidies. So if it's not clear that the program is going to provide a ton of benefit to individual farmers, and because most of these programs are paid for by the government in one fashion or another, they can typically figure out some sort of subsidy, a regulatory release, or a tax rebate that will benefit these growers and get them on board. All right. So, as you can tell from sort of the language of this, a major emphasis in these sort of pest control programs isn't necessarily on controlling pests in keeping them or managing them at low populations, so much as traditionally area-wide has been used to completely eradicate pests. So taking a pest in a system and just completely wiping it out so nobody has to worry about it again. And a good example of that would be something like the New World screw fly, right? They completely eradicated it from North America except for a tiny bit of Panama using these sorts of controls. And so generally, these programs are used in situations where you have some sort of invasive pest or a pest that causes really high damage to high-value crops. So things like Asian citrus psyllids that a single bite could potentially wipe out an entire tree. And so that's really where these programs have been, though lately there's been a lot of interest in using area-wide control, not just for eradicating really dangerous pests, but also for maintaining sort of common primary pests that we've been dealing with for a long time at tolerable levels, getting it more into that IPM focus. Can we use area-wide control to manage pests instead of just completely wipe them off the face of the earth? And there are some programs that are having success with this. And I think what we'll be doing here, is I've got a handful of slides talking about programs that range from eradication to suppression, just to give you an idea of how these sorts of things work. So a really good example of successful area-wide control that was early was for these Bufilius cattle ticks. Excuse me. So these are soft-bodied ticks. So when they feed, they swell up really large and get gross looking. And they feed on cattle, and the main thing they do is that they transfer various cattle fevers, in particular tick fever. And so here you see a cow that's just got ticks all up and down its backside, really heavy infestation. So in 1906, the growers basically got together in Texas and said, we want to eliminate this tick from Texas as much as possible. And so they started this program that was really targeted at, because they didn't have organosynthetic insecticides at the time to treat it, they thought, well, let's just starve these ticks to death. So they started a program where they mandated certain pastures in certain counties to be cattle-free for a period of, I believe, 3 years. It was a long enough period that the ticks would be completely unable to survive in the habitat without cattle. And they basically created these tick-free zones so they would move across the counties, and you create sort of this wall of inhospitable habitat that they couldn't live in. And then on top of that, they also started an arsenic dipping program where you dip all the cattle to kill off the ticks that were on them. And they had all these tick-free zones where you couldn't move cattle through various quarantines. And ultimately, within less than 30 years, by 1943, they had managed to completely eliminate this thing.
Oh, I thought that was 1,943 ticks eliminated from the U.S.
Fair enough. Really low success program. or there weren't very many ticks. You have to understand there weren't very many cows in Texas at this time.
Right.
No, but yeah, I say 1943 they'd been eliminated. And what was really exceptional about this was that the entire program cost the amount of money to basically do an annual level of control before they did the area-wide control program. So a lot of this stuff was very low cost but had really high effectiveness. On the flip side, on more of a suppressive scale, we have the case of fruit fly populations in Hawaii. So Hawaii just processes a ton of freight from all over the world, from the Pacific. It's got a ton of wild vegetation that can sustain all sorts of pests. And so they just naturally have problems with fruit flies essentially forever. If there's a fruit fly that can feed on crops, it lives in Hawaii right now. So Hawaii basically realized that there's no way that they're going to completely eliminate these flies using conventional approaches from sort of a perspective of just feasibility. They have a lot of land that they have to cover in the state, a lot of natural hosts the flies can feed on. And then on top of that, they would have a similar problem to California, that people wouldn't appreciate having tons of chemicals dumped all over the place within the state. And so what they've done is they've established an area-wide approach that's more in line with IPM, that they essentially use a really wide monitoring network in combination with high levels of sanitation and male annihilation. So male annihilation is basically just putting out tons and tons of female pheromone traps that attract the males in. And that way you're just severely reducing the male population over time. And in combination, these techniques have been, as well as releasing fly parasitoids. So in combination, all these techniques together have really pushed the population down. And because they're applying these techniques, not just in the fields, but in all the surrounding habitats as well as the forests, they've managed to keep the populations low and significantly reduce the amount of sprays that are occurring. Total benefit is estimated in about the 18 million range, which doesn't sound like a ton, but keep in mind that agriculture in Hawaii is much lower scale than it is here in California, and that this is still a pretty good return on the investment that the government put into this program. This is not agricultural at all, but I just thought it was kind of a neat program. So they have a big problem in the French Quarter of New Orleans in that it's more or less completely built out of these wooden buildings that termites really like to feed on, but they can't really just replace the buildings because it's kind of their tourist center, and it's where people are interested in going. And so they had this program to basically control these termites where essentially they would just spray all the blocks periodically with a insecticide around the base of the building. But in 1998, they contracted out to Louisiana State University to come up with an area-wide management strategy that was more in line with IPM ideals. And so what they went with instead of just spraying everything was they set up a monitoring program. So they set up these traps to catch alates, so the flying reproductive forms. They would monitor where the alates were most heavily found, and then they would basically create a scouting program around that, looking for buildings that have infestations, and then spot treating the colonies and removing rotting wood instead of just spraying everything. And ultimately, this cut down the population substantially and also saved a lot in terms of spraying. And then finally, this is the last one. So this is the example that's applicable in California agriculture. I mentioned this briefly, but in summary, pink bollworm, major pest of cotton across the world. It's pretty well established in the desert areas. So Arizona, I believe also in the Imperial Valley and areas where they still do grow cotton, they see pink bollworm. But it is not found regularly in the San Joaquin. And so back in the day when cotton was king of the San Joaquin Valley, there was a lot of desire to basically have some sort of program in place to stop an infestation from ever happening. And so that's where these pheromone traps came in. That essentially the cotton growers got together and created a program where you created a nice grid of these traps, about one every 600 acres. And every time they would catch a male moth in one of these traps, they would just douse the area with sterile male insects. And so one challenge with this was there was this concern that if you drop all these male insects, how will you be able to tell the difference between a male you dropped versus one you caught in the wild? So to get around that, when they rear out the males, they actually basically feed them on a pink dyed diet so that the male ones that come out have a nice pink color to them. So if you catch a truly pink male moth, then it's going to be one of the ones they reared. And this is, you can see it. Here's one of the airplanes dropping the moths. You can sort of see this real thin stream right there. That's just a whole bucket load of male moths getting dumped out of the back of an airplane. So with that, I'll take any questions, and